You did say that the Chamber of Commerce does help in fostering bilateral relations between countries. Now, I've been thinking
Yes,
about
yes.
I've been thinking about America-Africa relations for a while now. In the past 10 years or so, the relations between America and Africa generally has dwindled. It's in the gutters right now. And what, first of all, why do you think that is? You know, there's this divide between America and Africa. If you look at the charts, America's investment has
Yeah.
stagnated for a while now. America's investment in Africa has stagnated, while China's investment has gone through the roof. So why do you think there's this divide between America and Africa, given that both parties stand to benefit a whole lot? Africa has unquantifiable mineral resources, and of course, America has a lot of investment. So one would think that both parties should have a well-oiled relationship, but unfortunately, there's a divide between both parties, especially within the past 10 years. Why do you think that is?
Well, thank you very much. I'm an advocate, I'm pro-American, professionally, socially, in all ways. America has contributed immensely to my professional career trajectory and, of course, my social life. So I would always speak for America. But objectively speaking, I do not think there's a divide between Nigeria and America. What I think has happened is, over time, a bit of interest has dwindled. So some parties have decided to move backwards, not forgetting that whether you're talking about Russia, whether you're talking about the United Kingdom, we're talking about the US, every country is seeking dominance. Every country wants to be dominant. Every country wants to Africa. Now, who've always been there for us? America has always been there for us. Now, we have a relationship with China, which is not strange or alien, because we also have a relationship with the UK, we also have a relationship with Russia. But every country or every continent, every region trying to, prove dominance in Africa is not strange, because, Africa is the least developed continent on the planet, in the world, and the fastest developing continent in the world, Africa. Now, in the next few years, Africa would have the most youthful population the world has ever seen. We are well aware of that. Africa is home to millions and billions of natural resources. So it's only fair that the West, so to speak, the world scrambles for its natural resources. It's only fair that the world scrambles to forge a bilateral, multilateral, unilateral relationship with Africa. Now, what has happened over the years, or what we've seen with the US over the years, like I mentioned, it's not a divide. It's not, so to speak, a bit of I would say a slowdown in interest. Now, how this has happened is, over time, the US has been very focused on the US. So we've seen, from past presidents, they put the US at the forefront of their innovations, the forefront of their policies, to a reasonable extent, neglecting Africa. When I say neglecting Africa, not neglecting Africa in full swing, because we've seen so many initiatives from the US government, from the likes of, let's trickle it down to the times of Barack Obama. Barack Obama came up with AGOA. We've seen Prosper Africa, just to name a few of them. Now, the US has always had its niche in Africa, but what has happened, like I would reiterate and keep reiterating, is over time, there was a little bit of lack of interest expressed, and China came in to fill up this vacuum, especially in the infrastructure sector. So US provides aid to Africa, but a lot of times in form of humanitarian assistance. I dare say in the entire world, no country in the world, no continent has provided humanitarian assistance for growth and development to Africa as much as the US has done. So
I agree.
China has come invested infrastructural projects, speaking about roads, speaking about rails. You've seen what is happening in Rwanda, Uganda, to name a few of them. Now, China comes up with very juicy offers. So they're investing XYZ, $500 billion in your country, and at the end of the day, you're supposed to repay after a time frame. If we end up not repaying those loans, China takes over our assets. China takes over our minerals. That is what is obtainable. So it's not like China is doing us a favor. It's a two-way thing. They give us loans, and at the end of the day, if we're not able to repay these loans, they take over our assets, they take over our minerals, they take over some of our natural resources. Now ask yourself this question. For some of the loans that are being owed to China, how would Africa be able to pay even in the next 50 years? That's a question for debate for some other time. So US has always had interest in Africa. US has always had its, I wouldn't say tentacles, I would say it's niche in Africa. But like I mentioned, over time, the US has been very focused on itself. And so the interest in Africa to a reasonable extent dwindled, because they felt like there wasn't so much they could get from Africa. But now China is coming over and taking in full force. And of course, the US is not sleeping. The US is working tirelessly to ensure that the relationship between them and Africa is strengthened. We saw what happened recently with the US-Africa Summit, where we had over 40 African leaders in the United States, of course, discussing how the US can possibly support Africa's climate change goals, to name a few of them. Recently, there was a conference in the US, the Nigerian American Chamber of Commerce was proud to be part of. That's the Select USA Summit, where we had leaders from various countries in the world talking about investing in Africa. And of course, some of them were also talking about how they can possibly invest in Africa. We represented Nigeria, and it was a robust conversation we had. So the way forward is advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. And that's why we have chambers of commerce like ours, who continue to push out policy subjects, who continue to push out conversations on how to strengthen the relationship between Nigeria and the US. US happens to be a very key trading partner in Nigeria, and we cannot afford, to allow the vacuums between Africa, Nigeria, and the US stay or linger for so long. Finally, to close this particular question, I'd like to say that foreign direct investment between the United States and Nigeria, and I'm sorry, I keep making reference to Nigeria. Nigeria is like the largest country in Africa in terms of population. So to a reasonable extent, when you've covered Nigeria, you've covered the most of sub-Saharan Africa. But we saw that the investments from the US to Africa doubled in 2022 compared to what we had in 2022. So all 2021. So all hope is not lost. All hands are on deck. Chambers will continue to do what they do, and we as communicators would continue to communicate the right messages to the right people, hoping that they'll listen. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think you already answered the question, but let me just ask, how do you think this divide can be breached from a Chamber of Commerce perspective?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, it can be breached by communication and advocacy. So we come up with policy subjects. We were in the US recently. I was in the US recently. What are we talking about? Who are we talking to? We met a few policymakers. How can we possibly foster positive working collaborations between US and Nigeria? AGOA is set to expire in a few years, and we're seeking to see how AGOA can be renewed. What's
AGOA?
Benefit from AGOA?
What's AGOA? I don't know.
Okay, AGOA is African Growth and Opportunities Act that allows Africans to export their products to the US on very minimal or almost no tariff. So, if you're exporting to the US, you have to pay your taxes. Sometimes the fees can be enormous, magnanimous, magnificent. So AGOA is put together by the United States government, precisely the US Department of State Trade and Commerce, to make it very sublime, the fees and the taxes that we pay on goods that we export to the US, almost paying nothing. So as long as your goods measure up the requirements, the standards, you can export to the US for almost nothing. Now, you also need to be sure that you're exporting the goods and products and services that fit into the category of goods, products, and services that ought to be exported. So to respond to your question directly, when you're talking about what can possibly be done, advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. That's the number one role of any Chamber of Commerce, advocacy. So we speak to our business communities. What would you like to see? What do you want to hear? What would you like to have the government do? And then we push these messages. As a Chamber of Commerce, we have a voice. The government listens. The business communities listens at all levels. So I think the first thing that's supposed to be done, the first thing that should be done is, strengthening advocacy. Then the next thing is Africans engaging more with the diaspora community. So we have a lot of business people we have a lot of businesses and business entities in the US that are owned by Africans. What impact are these businesses making? These businesses are successful in their own rights, but are they able to compete favorably with other businesses that are of international standards, other businesses that are internationally recognized? We need to up our ante. Africa already has, so to speak, a label. So gone are the days where the world used to see everything that comes from Africa as inferior or lower quality. These times have changed. I see a lot of traders in Africa doing well with multinational organizations. So we need to up our ante. We need to up our ante. We need to up the quality of the things we produce and export. We need to up the quality of the things we manufacture and export out of Africa. Then a few other things that would need to be done is, like I mentioned, still boils down to policy, engaging with the right people, engaging with policymakers, stakeholders. Gone are the days where the policymakers and stakeholders in the US just sat back in the US, not visiting Africa. Now, with the US-Africa Economic Summit, immediately after the US-Africa Economic Summit, we saw Her Excellency Vice President Kamala Harris visiting Africa, touring a few countries in Africa. All of that is to strengthen the relationships that Africa and the US has. So we need to try as much as we can to advocate for more policymakers from the US to visit Africa, come to Africa, interact with us, interface with us, and you'd see that the numbers, the statistics and figures are not as bad as you think.